Awesome. Thank you so much, Nicole. Hi, everyone. Welcome to inclusiveaccess.org's Inclusive or Exclusive, Reexamining Inclusive Access Textbook Programs. I'm going to be your presenter for this session. My name is Trudy Radke, and I'm an Open Education Project Manager at Spark, which is assisting with this Inclusive Access Initiative. And Nicole Allen, who is our Director of Open Education from Spark, has been kind enough to help me moderate this and is also working on the technical side of things. So before we get started, I just want to mention that we didn't go for a webinar view with this. Instead, we wanted to have more of that kind of homey Zoom feel. And the reason for that is that we really want to encourage you guys as participants to interact and ask those questions. I am going to try to leave a nice chunk of questions or a nice chunk of time for questions at the end. So feel free to stick your questions in the chat. And Nicole will get to those as she can, but also there will be a time at the end. So don't worry, I'm going to try to pad it nicely. So yeah, we are going to present this to you guys today. It looks like people are filing in, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. So before we officially dive into things, I want to acknowledge two things. So first, it's Open Education Week, and that's the point of this webcast, and I am super excited to be here with you all. The second thing I want to acknowledge is that there's a lot going on in the world right now. I'm sure you've all been following what's going on in Ukraine in the news. And it would just feel disingenuous of me to not at least acknowledge that there's just a lot going on in the world right now. There's a lot of individuals that find themselves in challenging contexts. So I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that, even as we celebrate Open Education Week. But I'm excited to be here with you all. Like I said, as educators and as open advocates, what we do is we try to do our best to remove barriers to knowledge, to promote equitable, an equitable society. And it's a marathon, not a sprint, but it definitely helps when you enjoy the people you're running with. So I just wanted to take time to, one, acknowledge that, but also say that I'm grateful that you were willing to share your time with us today. So without further ado, let's do this. All right, so first, we're going to just define terms so that we make sure we're all coming from the same place. A lot of you might be familiar with inclusive access textbook programs. We here call them automatic textbook billing programs, as well as inclusive access. So you might be familiar, but just to give a quick definition on what is inclusive access, essentially it's a textbook sales model that adds the cost of digital course content into students' tuition and fees. And these are models that have been created by publishers. So what is inclusiveaccess.org? So inclusiveaccess.org is an initiative to help educators and policymakers and open advocates get the facts on inclusive access programs so that you guys can make informed decisions on how to interact with these if they come to your campus, and how to have productive conversations around what these inclusive access programs actually can offer your campus and your students. So we're going to do this in kind of stages. So now that we've defined inclusive access, I'm going to give a little bit of historical context for inclusive access, and then we're going to dig into a little bit more of the nitty gritty. What does inclusive access actually look like? How do the models work? How do the models vary campus to campus? And then we're actually going to dig into how the models work specifically for students. So what claims do these inclusive access textbook models make? And what is the reality of those claims? And what real world implications do those claims have for our students and our campuses? So inclusive access programs started to come into being, I would say, in the early 2010s, mid 2010s, but they didn't really start to gain traction until the late 2010s. So you can see this Inclusive Access Takes Off article was published by Inside Higher Ed on November 7th, 2017. And I think it's worth pausing here to talk about why these inclusive access programs started cropping up when they did. So as we know, we are in the open education OER movement. This is Open Ed Week. Open advocates, students, faculty, administrators had been saying for a very long time that textbook costs were just outrageously high, that there was no way students could afford it, and that students were struggling to obtain their learning materials. And I think that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that inclusive access programs from publishers cropped up in response to activism from the OER movement, from the open movement, student activists saying, we can't afford these textbooks, we need better solutions. And eventually publishers were forced to come to the table and start paying attention, because OER and students just not being able to afford their products was cutting into their bottom line. So the two biggest claims that inclusive access makes is that it's affordable for students and that students have access to the materials on the first day of class. But I think it's just important to note that those goals of inclusive access, they didn't just spring forth. They didn't just come out of nowhere. This is in direct response to OER and student advocacy on the issue of high textbook costs in America. And I think it's significant whenever a corporation decides to respond to those kinds of that kind of activism, it's because there really is something to that. There really is something there. So how does inclusive access work? So we're going to kind of dig down into the nitty-gritty of this, and we're going to get increasingly into the weeds, but we'll start with a general overview. So there's 4 basic ways that these programs generally work. They start with an agreement between an institution, a bookstore, and the publishers. The digital content from these programs is delivered to students at the start of the course, and it's typically through the learning management system. So Canvas, Blackboard, Moodle, what have you. Third, students have a period to opt out before they are automatically billed for the cost of their materials. So it's called an opt-out model. And finally, after the course ends, students typically lose access to the content. So my experience with talking to publishers and doing research on this, sometimes it is longer than a semester, but generally students lose access to content after about a semester. The longest I've ever seen these agreements go for is about a year. So when we talk about students accessing digital publisher materials, these are digital rentals. So we've talked about how they're kind of all the same. How are they a little bit different? How do these programs vary campus to campus? So one, most campuses deploy it on a course by course basis, but there is a growing number of campuses where it is by program or campus wide. I think there's a lot of reason or evidence to suggest that the course by course model is popular because inclusive access is still relatively new. It's still kind of new on the scene. People are still figuring it out. They're trying to determine if it's an actual viable option. But in the more recent years, we have seen more of a shift towards that campus or program-wide adoption. Second, students typically get billed the cost of their materials, but sometimes they're billed a flat fee. So in that course by course, they're billed for materials, but if they're kind of doing a program or campus-wide, it'll be more of a flat fee for the students to access that publisher's content for their courses. And then finally, access is mostly limited to expiring digital materials, so those digital rentals I was talking about, but occasionally there is longer term access or print rentals. And we're going to get a little deeper into the specifics of that in just a second. So let's talk a little bit about the phrase inclusive access. So I think it behooves us to give a little context. When activists started kind of responding to this publisher model and realizing it was a thing and wondering how inclusive and equitable it actually was, there was some consideration of, should we kind of fight the publishers on the name they've chosen, inclusive access? Certain advocates felt that that wasn't really an accurate way to describe what these publishers were offering. We here at Spark and Inclusive Access sometimes call it automatic textbook billing. We feel like that's a little bit more transparent. However, by the time activists kind of rallied to this and realized what was going on with publishers, inclusive access was kind of already entrenched in the consumer's mind. So instead of trying to spend a lot of energy and resources fighting that kind of entrenched terminology, we at inclusiveaccess.org adopted it and just tried to raise awareness about how these models work. So inclusive access is the most popular name for these models, but you will see several names. And this has to do with the fact that often when campuses adopt these, they tend to brand them so that it's like specific to their campus. So all of the terms you see here on the screen are names for these inclusive access programs, inclusive access being the most popular. So all access, all inclusive, all students acquire, auto access, equitable access, instant access, included, which is a little precocious for my taste, but it is one that we have seen. So these are all names for these inclusive access or automatic textbook billing models. So who are the largest vendors? Who are publishers that are pushing these and coming up with these models? So obviously the big three publishers are steeped in inclusive access. So we've got Cengage, McGraw-Hill, and Pearson, as well as technology or courseware providers. So the two most popular being VitalSource and RedShelf. And then bookstores, college bookstores, have also begun offering these types of inclusive access programs. So Barnes & Noble and Follett also offer some type of inclusive access model. Barnes & Noble, I believe, calls theirs First Aid Complete, and Follett just calls theirs Access, all caps. So within the inclusive access model, there are two primary models that publishers, technology companies, or bookstores usually offer. So the two models are a la carte or flat fee. So the a la carte model, which I've already kind of touched on, is that students are charged the cost of specific materials they have been assigned. So specific textbooks for specific courses or specific courseware for specific courses. And then there is the flat fee model, which is that students are charged a flat amount based on how many units or credit hours they are taking, no matter what their specific materials cost would be. So this is a flat fee for students based on their credit hours, and it's charged as a fee. These fees are optional. It is an opt-out model, like I mentioned earlier. However, that does put the onus on students to opt out. So if students don't go through the process of opting out, if they want to get their textbooks from elsewhere, they are allowed to do that, but they will have to opt out. Otherwise, they will be charged at the beginning of the semester. So we wanted to provide you a real life example of kind of this flat fee model, which we're noticing is growing in popularity. So this is the Technical College of the Low Country, and their model is $22 per credit hour. So basically, if the student's taking 15 units, and now I just realized I've put myself in a position where I have to do math, and math is not my strong suit, so I'll just let you all do the mental math in your heads. But basically, this school offers access to this inclusive access program at $22 per credit hour. I think that's around $300 and some dollars if the student was taking 15 units that semester for all of their course materials. All right, so we've already covered a lot of ground. We've defined inclusive access, we've given a little bit of context, talked about the history, talked about why we're using the term inclusive access. And now we're going to dig into what do inclusive access programs claim to offer our students and our campuses, and what is the reality behind those claims? So really the purpose of this entire presentation is to get you guys the facts on inclusive access. And this is the section of the presentation where we're really going to dive into that. First, we'll start with one of the largest, or like, I guess, the biggest claim that these inclusive access models are making, their claim to fame, which is that they save students money, that inclusive access models are an affordable textbook solution. As I mentioned, publishers are responding to students and faculty and campus personnel that are saying textbooks are too expensive. So they're offering these inclusive access models as a big way of saying, we can make this material more affordable for your students. You can still get it from us. You can still get it from your trusted publishers, but we are going to make it a lot more affordable because we are hearing that affordability is an issue. We call this section savings or spin. So basically, inclusive access content is discounted. That is true compared to print prices. But the real question is by how much? So I think it's worth noting that when these programs claim to offer discounts, and they are offering discounts, the discount they are offering is based on the list price of a brand new current edition textbook from that publisher's website. So the cost of a brand new current edition textbook. So as long as it's some amount cheaper than that, it is technically a savings for the student. I would argue that we're familiar with textbook prices and that those prices tend to be and have been inflated. So how much of a savings is up for debate, but that is the price list they are using to determine discounts. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done air quotes. I couldn't resist. So once again, this is kind of information I feel like as open advocates, we already know. 2 in 3 students say they decided against buying a textbook because the cost is too high. And I believe this is a statistic from around 2020 from Student Pergs. This is, you know, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here. This is information we know. We know textbooks are too expensive. We've been saying this for a very, very long time. And I was one of these students. When I went to college, I could not afford my textbooks. My first semester, I just went to the back, gave them the list of the books I needed. They brought all my books up. I went to check out. I didn't even think to check the prices. I come from a lower socioeconomic background. I was the first person in my family to go to college. And you can imagine my surprise when I, you know, put my textbooks down on the counter and they rung them up and it was like $700. And there, I was flabbergasted. I was floored. There was just no way I was going to be able to pay that. So I left without buying a single textbook for the semester. I couldn't afford it. And I didn't buy a textbook the semester after that. And I didn't buy a textbook the semester after that. And you can kind of detect a pattern here. And I found ways around it. I found other ways to get my learning materials because I just could not afford the sticker price of those textbooks. And eventually by my fourth semester, I started to figure out how to like kind of get around it, how to rent from the library, how to find discounted copies, but often I was just borrowing my friends. Once again, information that I feel like is preaching to the choir, but we know that the textbook market has been highly inflated for 2 decades. The price of college textbooks has way outpaced the price of or the baseline of inflation pretty aggressively. There is kind of a quote that I always think about from my mom. The older I get, the more my mom's sayings start to stick in my head. And one of her big ones was, "What hurts you can't heal you." And I have to admit that when I think about inclusive access models, that is one that comes to mind because textbook publishers are now claiming to have the affordability solution for high textbook prices. When textbook publishers have been controlling those prices for the past several decades and you know, gradually wrenching them higher and higher and higher. So it is a more affordable solution, but I would contest their definition of affordability and also kind of how they're getting there. All right, so our next section is called convenient or confined, and this kind of tackles the second largest claim that these inclusive access models make. So their first claim to fame is we are lowering the price of textbooks. We've covered that. We've covered some of the logic behind it. Their second largest claim is that first day access component. So another thing that came up a lot in, you know, textbook affordability advocacy is that not only are these textbooks so expensive, making them expensive forces students to find cheaper alternatives, which means they don't have their learning materials the first day of class, which can really impact success and retention rates in a course if the student doesn't have half of what they need to be successful in any given course. So inclusive access models claim to fix that. They're like, our content is digital, it's delivered through your LMS, your students get it the first day of class. And that claim is true. That is how these models are operating. So they can provide that first day access to content. But our question at inclusiveaccess.org is, does that constrain student choice? And does that infringe on their rights as a consumer? And students are savvy consumers. So I kind of mentioned when I realized textbooks, sorry about that, when I realized textbooks were too expensive, I looked for different ways to find my learning materials. I borrowed friends. I would check it out from the library one at a time and take pictures of the book. I was doing all kinds of stuff. And yes, I'm ashamed to admit, I even did do some illegal downloading here and there to offset the cost of these textbooks. And you'll note in trends in student spending, this is how many students have responded to high textbook costs. They have found ways around it. They've shopped for secondhand books, older editions to kind of defray some of the cost of textbooks. So trends in student spending on textbooks have been declining over the past 5, 6, 7 years. You'll notice on this graph that there is an uptick right around 2020 during the pandemic. And that's because there was reduced access to lower cost rentals and secondhand materials due to shortages that the pandemic kind of created and produced. You'll also notice the last bullet there. Another accounting for the uptick in prices is one, so students couldn't get these secondhand models or these secondhand books. They couldn't do what they were normally doing to offset costs. So they were just going back to the publishers and paying these higher prices. But you'll notice the last bullet, publishers slightly raised prices. So not to be a dead horse, but what hurts you can't heal you. There is definitely some price adjustments going on with these publishers. And I think it's important not to overly judge corporations, but to hold them accountable for what I would call patterns of behavior. When you have a pattern of behavior, if you're a textbook company and you have a pattern of raising your textbook costs consistently, way, in a sense that it's way outside the rate of inflation. And then when we have a pandemic, we notice that happening again. Maya Angelou has an amazing quote that says, when someone tells you who they are, believe them the first time. And so I believe that when we deal with corporations, looking for patterns is in our best interest. How have corporations and publishers dealt with these things in the past? It might give us some insight as how they're going to deal with it in the future. So these are just some tweets from students. It's always important to include student voices. So these are just some tweets from students on inclusive access models. So, if I had been a student and they had this at my school, I probably also would have agreed with the first student there on the left and opted out. I have to admit the one on the right is my favorite. Inclusive access turns out to be truly inclusive. Everyone is without access to the course textbook first week of class. A little bit of tongue in cheek there. So yeah, students have thoughts and opinions on this. And I think this kind of goes back to students being savvy consumers. I don't think students like to be patronized to. I think students are looking for solutions that really work. And if inclusive access works for students, great. If it's really helping them, excellent. But that's why we're here, right? We're here to ask the tough questions and really determine what's best for our campuses and our students. So we spent a whole lot of time talking about students, which I think is appropriate because they are the primary population impacted by high textbook costs. But what about faculty? We have reason to believe that there is potential for inclusive access to limit faculty academic freedom to choose the materials that really help their students learn best. And the big reason for this is who makes decisions about inclusive access. So who's actually responsible for onboarding these programs on a campus? As you can see, the majority of the time, administration is responsible for making these types of choices about faculty learning material in terms of inclusive access models. And the reason for that is that anytime an institution decides to purchase a subscription for learning materials or for a learning application, that is made at the administrative level. So in my previous hat, before I came to Spark, I was an education technology specialist at a California community college. It's actually most of my background is in the California community college system. And as an ed tech specialist, I was responsible for all of the ed tech acquisitions for our campus. So I worked very, very closely with Academic Senate. I worked very, very closely with our distance education coordinator, and I reported to our vice president of academic affairs. So even though we were getting faculty input every time we purchased an application, we were looking for faculty input in Academic Senate. But bottom line, the decision and the push for these decisions often came from our VP of Academic Affairs. She was the individual who had access to her funding. She was the individual that was making these high levels decisions, as she should, about the kinds of subscriptions that the campus as a whole was going to commit to. So this really is a different kind of way of approaching learning materials, because when you're talking about purchasing learning materials for a campus versus a professor determining what's best for their course, that decision is largely made by administrators. It's not that faculty aren't involved, but it does generally become an administrator decision. And that's worth considering in these conversations about inclusive access, is that when publishers frame their content not as a course by course, when they're not, I would say, marketing to course, but rather marketing to an institution, it really shifts the power dynamics in who's making decisions about learning materials in the case of inclusive access programs. All right, another one that we're going to discuss today is dealer data mine. I am super, super passionate about this one. And basically our claim is this: inclusive access content can capture vast amounts of data on students and faculty. So like I mentioned before, I used to be an education technology specialist responsible for ed tech acquisitions. And in ed tech and in online education, there is a growing concern. I think it's existed for a very long time, but there is a growing concern about gathering data on students from ed tech companies, from any private corporation that is, that's selling ed tech to institutions. It's gathering data on those students. So part of my job as an ed tech specialist, when I was vetting applications that we were considering onboarding to the campus, I read a lot of contracts. So professionally, I was responsible for reading contracts, for determining, okay, what are the students actually being asked to sign up for? What data is this company going to have access to? Who's getting this data? Who's this data being shared with within the school? But more importantly, within the company, who has access to this data within your company? And basic stuff. Is it going to meet FERPA? Are we going to make sure we don't have any FERPA violations? And in my time reading through these contracts and working with vendors, I actually did make the decision to part ways with a remote proctoring system that my institution had been using for quite a while, because when I dug into the contract language, when it came time to renew, this program had been there before I got there, I was quite frankly appalled at the contract language. I felt that there was huge potential for misuse of student data, and we terminated our contract with them based on that. And the funny thing is that these programs, inclusive access programs from publishers, they're not shy about mentioning that they do collect student data. And the reason I think they're not shy about it is because it's kind of par for the course now for big technology companies. We all know that they're just collecting data on their users. And these inclusive access programs are actually even kind of selling this as a selling point to institutions, saying that faculty and administration will also have access to these reading analytics, and that can help them do better in presenting this information to students. So reading analytics, for example, it tracks when a student opens their textbook, how long they spend on a page, what pages they go to, how often they open their textbook, all kinds of stuff. And while there is potential for that data to be used for good, I think there's also another side to it. So first, anytime you're collecting that much data, there's always the potential for a data breach. There's just always the potential that there's going to be a hole in the security system, and that there's the potential for that data to be accessed by nefarious actors. So that is a concern, and it's a valid concern, because it's one that in the 21st century, we've seen a lot with large private corporations that have a lot of individual data. Data breaches are par for the course these days. And even though it hasn't happened yet and its security systems are improving, it definitely should be a consideration when we are signing, these massive contracts with private corporations that deal with this kind of data. Second, contract language, there's securities these companies have in place to protect data against breaches, but what is the company going to use the data for? And could there be potential violations there with how they're going to use the student data? Are they going to sell the student data? This is stuff that we have to dig deep into these contracts to find. And I think it's worth noting that we need to be really transparent with our students about what we are agreeing for them to give up on their, we're telling them when we make these decisions, oh yeah, you can have access to our student data. So just students really understand what they're agreeing to when they sign on to an inclusive access program. I mentioned earlier, I read contract language as a professional. So professionally, I am used to reading contract language when it comes to tech companies and what they're offering. So I did that for a living, and constantly I'm using applications outside of that context where I'm clicking that terms and conditions button. I accept the terms and conditions. I'm not always taking the time to actually read those terms and conditions. Sometimes I download an application and I need to use it today. So I have a professional understanding of contract language, and I am certainly not reading the terms and conditions on every application I interact with in my daily life. How much less so are students? And as you can see on the screen, there's data to back that up. The average student is in the red in terms of understanding publisher data collection, and honestly, even at large ed tech data collection, and their policies and how that data will be used. So I think it's important when we make these agreements with these corporations and when we have these kinds of contracts, there's a potential for a data breach. And also, are they informed consumers? Do they really understand? And are we making it a point to help them understand what kinds of terms and conditions they are agreeing to? Okay, so the good news is I didn't bring you guys all here today just to bum you out, make you sad. The purpose of this was not to kind of, talk about the nefarious potential for inclusive access programs. The point of this is to provide you with tools as educators, as open advocates. on how to have conversations about inclusive access, how to navigate inclusive access. So as it expands across the country, what can you do to have engaging and enriching conversations about these publisher models? So once again, preaching to the choir, this first one is kind of a no-brainer. We call this OER versus inclusive access. OER is a great way to fill these gaps that we notice with textbook affordability, with access to learning materials. OER is a great way to provide a solution for the things that student activists and open activists have been saying has been a problem for a long time, which is that access to affordable learning materials. So with OER, digital access is available day one at no cost to students. It's free forever, right? We know this. In inclusive access, digital access is available by day one, but students are billed. It is a pay to play model. Second, students can choose low cost options with OER, low cost print options. So there's choice there as a consumer. In inclusive access models, print rentals may be available, so they may or may not offer that, but if they are available, they're available at an additional cost. So whatever the student is already paying to access that inclusive access program, they are going to have to pay more on top in order to obtain a differentiated learning material. Third, students retain access to the materials forever in OER. And then of course, it's inclusive access, as we've mentioned, it typically expires at the end of the course, or maybe at the end of the year. And first of all, there's a very important practical aspect to being able to keep your course materials for longer than that. So I had a conversation with my partner. They're a mathematician. They're in a statistics program, master's program right now. And they were asking a little about my work, and I was explaining inclusive access, and they were saying, oh, wow, that wouldn't work for calculus, which is a prerequisite for any kind of applied mathematics. All applied mathematics students have to take all levels of calculus 1, 2, and 3 at some point in their life. And my partner was sharing with me that often they use the same book. So that's one book for 3 semesters. So right there, they were pointing out that maybe just buying that one book directly for a calculus student for calculus 1, 2, and 3, that's technically more cost effective than having to renew a subscription to the same calculus book 3 semesters in a row. So there's a practical reason for this permanent access to your learning material to be important to students. But also, is there an ethical aspect to this as well? What kind of message does it send to our students ethically if at the end of a course they're cut off from their learning material? That's it. It's a pay to play. It's behind a paywall. And it's not even behind an initial paywall. It's behind a recurring paywall. I think that we could, I think it would behoove us to at some point even dig into the ethics of that. Like, what does it say to students when we have, it's like a timed access to knowledge, a timed access to a learning material? What does that say about learning and the best ways to approach it? And then last but not least, we know this, OER is openly licensed. Faculty can adopt it to their local needs, their cultural needs. Faculty can make equitable, culturally relevant, anti-racist content for their courses if they so choose, because OER is remixable. You can adapt it for your specific needs. Inclusive access, it's just like original publisher content. It's all rights reserved. It's copyrighted. So what can you guys do? What can we all do as open activists? So first, be proactive. Make sure admin, faculty, students, they're aware of OER initiatives on campus and why those have an impact. Are there other things currently already in place on campuses that could kind of fill the gaps that inclusive access is trying to come in and fill? Can we find lower cost materials for students that's available the first day of class? Can we find creative ways to offer more materials digitally to our students? If that seems to be the direction that we want to move, and if that seems to be a faster way to get students the materials they need. Second, ask questions. Challenge your campus to thoroughly examine the legal, financial, and ethical implications of new models. Reading that contract language is so important. It's very dry. It's not, Sunday morning comics. It's dry reading, but it really is worth it because the answers are often in that contract language of what a school is actually signing up for in these programs. Be rigorous. Ensure all the claims about benefits and savings are backed up by evidence, including research and numbers. Schools are schools are and can be savvy consumers. They're allowed to ask something of the people claiming to provide them a service and being like, I need to see the numbers here. I need to, have a conversation about price caps. Are you just going to wrench up the cost of these programs annually? Like, how is that going to work? It behooves us to ask those questions. And then last but not least, center equity. Put students' needs and voices at the center of the conversation. The best way to find out what a population needs is to ask the population directly. And the fabulous thing about students is that if given a platform, they will tell us what they need. Students are great at knowing what they need and expressing that if they're just given the platform to do so. There's always time to consult and listen. And I think investing in student opinions and student knowledge, the returns on that investment is just exponential. Anytime we do that, I feel like we really cut to the chase in terms of providing what our students actually need in an equitable and accessible way. All right, what resources do we offer? So we actually offer a lot of what we've already covered in this presentation. So we offer common questions to ask, so quick question sheets for faculty, administration, even policymakers and students, questions that they can ask inclusive access retailers about their programs, about what they actually offer, fact sheets for various stakeholder groups, myth versus facts. So we have everything I've covered in the presentation and even more on our website. So it's these kind of cool color blocks, savings or spin, deal or data mine, and they're a little bit longer, in-depth dives into those topics, and you can download them as PDFs. You can pass them out to your board. You can pass them out in academic senate meeting, share them on Zoom. We're also working on building out our Spark contracts library. So anytime an organization makes an agreement with an inclusive access program, we FOIA that contract and we collect it so that you guys can have access to that contract. You can read the contract language directly and see how contracts between institutions compare. And then coming soon, we're going to kind of flesh out that OER versus inclusive access fact sheet, round it out a little bit, put it up on our website. So that's something else that you guys can have on hand to pass out to a board, to academic senate, to kind of start having conversations about inclusive access that are backed by research, and just providing you guys resources to get everyone on the same page. The bottom line is, why are we doing this activism? Why does inclusiveaccess.org exist? Why all of the hoopla around this? Well, the bottom line is that students can't learn from books they can't afford. I was that student. I mentioned that earlier, and it's true. It's a simple, powerful, impactful, and honest statement. The bottom line is, if a student can't afford that learning material, all these attempts at access won't matter if it's still just right out of what the student can reach. And I think that as educators, as open activists, as people that care deeply about equity and future generations, I think it behooves us to ask ourselves, what are the most strategic and creative ways that we can come up with solutions to this problem of textbook affordability? And maybe it is inclusive access. Maybe for your campus, that is a good choice. But we encourage you to kind of get the facts, understand what's really being offered, and see if there are alternative ways to get your students the content that they need to be successful. All right, so I hope I have made good, at least in part, on my promise to you guys to get you the facts on inclusive access. If you want to access any of the resources I've discussed today, that logo says it all. We are inclusiveaccess.org. I'm going to drop that link in the chat, but if you lose it or forget, just type inclusiveaccess.org into Google and it'll come right up. I promised to leave some time for questions, and I have left a whopping 20 minutes for questions. I planned on leaving maybe 15, but now we have 20. I'm not going to be mad about it. I'd actually really like to hear from you guys. I see quite a lot of comments in the chat. Haven't opened that yet. But yeah, I'll turn it over to questions now.
Yeah, thanks, Trudy. So we have had a very lively chat during this wonderful presentation. So I've actually pulled out a couple of the issues to address. There was a lot of discussion about issues of perpetual access, accessibility, and homework platform systems. There was also a lot of sort of comparisons between OER and inclusive access, and you know, sort of how we navigate having multiple tools in our toolbox to try to, you know, help students. And there were a few things brought up about, you know, sort of questions about the economics of this model, like how does it actually save students money? Does it save students money? Questions about the opt-out process and, you know, whether students are able to take advantage of those used books and rentals. So, you know, a lot of the sort of challenges that you brought up were brought out in the chat with a number of people sharing their individual examples. So I think the first issue that maybe I will address is the issue of perpetual access, since that was one of the things that there was a lot of back and forth on. So there were a number of participants in the webcast who were pointing out that inclusive access materials are, you know, sometimes do offer perpetual access or longer term access. And while that is true in some cases, as Trudy pointed out, it is not the norm. And that's borne out by the contracts in the contract library. And if somebody from the Spark team can put that link in the chat to the contract library, people can go and sort of see for yourselves. There are examples like Ohio Link, the library consortium in Ohio was successful in negotiating with a number of publishers to provide perpetual access for all of the inclusive access textbooks. But if you, as some of the people in the chat pointed out, and if you read the fine print, what perpetual access actually means is not what you think it is. You know, so it may be the case where you have to like remember where to find it in your LMS, or it may be the kind of thing where it's like a heavily DRM'd file that you have to download to a specific computer and you need to unlock with a code. And then if you get a new computer, you're not able to transfer the files. So, you know, I think there's a lot of, you know, language out there about what perpetual access is offered, but the reality of it maybe isn't quite what we expect it to be. And I think just, you know, thinking about why we created this initiative, inclusiveaccess.org. This is an initiative backed by organizations representing, you know, consortia and universities, student groups, faculty groups, and there's a lot of information out there that's being provided by vendors. And Trudy shared some of the names of the main vendors out there, but there are a lot of them. And there are a lot of people who, a lot of companies that are in a position to make a lot of money on this kind of model. And of course are going to share a lot of information about the benefits. And what we think is important is to make sure that higher education is equipped with the facts, and sort of the other side of the story, to be able to critically examine whether these models are right for your students, and understand the impact that it has. Because, you know, we all agree that textbooks are too expensive, and it's a challenge that we have an obligation to address on behalf of our students. But what we see happening across the country is that institutions are, you know, sort of jumping at these solutions that are being offered by vendors, and maybe not having the full set of facts about the longer range impact for students. So, you know, that's our goal here. And I think this issue around perpetual access is a really important one to consider, and make sure that, you know, to the extent we are hearing things like, oh, inclusive access comes with perpetual access. Well, which publishers are we talking about? How does that work? How do we explain to students what sort of they can expect from those digital materials? And most importantly, are we asking the right questions to make sure that the perpetual access isn't just perpetual access if you continue paying for it? Because I've seen a lot of that. You know, you can have access to Pearson Plus or Cengage Unlimited as long as you keep paying the fee. So, you know, our goal here is to equip people with you know, sort of the full set of facts to critically examine these programs, as the title of the webcast said. So I think The second issue that we saw in the chat coming out a lot was just this issue of accessibility with digital materials. Are inclusive access materials accessible? For that matter, are OER accessible? Are you able to make publisher materials accessible, and how does that differ from your ability to do that with OER? So maybe Trudy, you can say a little bit about accessibility and sort of how to navigate that space.
Sure, absolutely. So it's kind of a two-pronged question here, because we're talking about access with the capital A, and then we're talking about accessibility with the capital A. So first, I guess I'll address accessibility. And when I talk about accessibility, I'm talking about 508 compliance. Can you read it on a screen reader? That type of stuff. And Nicole, is that kind of what people were getting at?
Capital A accessibility.
Capital A accessibility. Okay, great. So I think the important thing to start out as, and I'll give a little more of my own background on this, just to provide you guys some context where I'm coming from with this question. So part of my experience in the California community college system was as an open educational resources specialist. And in that role, I led with a team of several open educational resource specialists, and we created, adapted, remixed over 150, a little over 150 open educational resource textbooks. And accessibility was a huge consideration in that program, because we had to make sure that the federal funds and the state funds that we were receiving to make these textbooks, we had to produce a textbook that was 508 compliant, that could be read by a screen reader, and that was truly, truly accessible to students. So I guess I'll address publisher accessibility first. So there's laws and there's language that forces corporations to make their content accessible. So yes, I would say across the board, most inclusive access products are accessible because corporations are forced to make their content accessible, make it 508 compliant so that it can be accessed by screen readers. Now, here's my caveat to that. Is it intentionally accessible? And here's what I mean by that. So in my role as an open educational resource specialist, creating those textbooks, we struggled with accessibility a lot, because as many of you may well know, accessibility, it's kind of a bit of a band-aid on a bullet hole. And what I mean by that is the internet and all this digital content has existed it came on the scene very fast. We were putting stuff on the internet quickly, and accessibility kind of had to play catch up. Accessibility activists kind of had to come running behind the internet and say, hey, guys, you need to make this stuff so that everybody can access it. This is an equity issue. We all need to be able to access this content. So a lot of 508 compliance and making things accessible on the internet is kind of these tacked on fixes to the way the internet already works, to try to make this, a little bit, sometimes it can feel like fitting a square peg in a round hole, trying to make things accessible on the internet. And that is definitely something that my team and I ran into a lot. We would talk to, advocates at the state level. We would talk to accessibility experts at the state level, and they had a lot of great feedback. But the bottom line is that there's kind of a lot of gray area in accessibility, because we're still figuring it out to a large extent. I know that's kind of a crazy thing to say in 2022, but in terms of practical screen reader differentiated accessibility, we're still trying to make things on the internet as truly accessible as they need to be. And our team soon realized when we were making these textbooks that even though we were following official guidelines, we weren't sure that these were really accessible for real screen reader users. So we hired an individual. Her name was Lauren. She was absolutely fabulous. She was blind, and she used a screen reader and assistive technology to read her school books. And we had her check our OER textbooks with a screen reader. We said, we want you to read these like you normally would, and tell us, we're following these guidelines, but are they accessible? Are they really accessible to you as a student? Not just literally accessibility, but can you access the information easily? Is it logical? And we were shocked, because we were following these official guidelines, and she would come back to us and say, it was good. She was way too nice. It was good. It was a good, you tried, you did a lot of it right. You did most of it right. And then she would provide us this really invaluable feedback on how to improve our process, how to make these books really readable to someone with a screen reader, so that it's logical. There's no lag. There's none of this like too much information or too little, so that the student gets exactly what they need, so that they're having this streamlined experience. And I call that intentional accessibility. that's an accessibility where we care about the end user so much. There's a real equity concern about the end user of that product. So in order, to contextualize this larger issue, are publisher materials technically accessible? Yes, they have to be. There's legal things that force them to make it accessible. Is it intentional accessibility? No. I would argue from my position that it's not always intentional. It's letter of the law accessibility, but they are compliant and hopefully working on being more than compliant. But more often than not, I just see compliance. So I know that was kind of a long-winded way to say yes, but I hope that provided some helpful context to that question.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, and issues of accessibility are ones that are challenges we face with all digital materials, as you say, and something that we need to keep in mind throughout all of these conversations, regardless of what type of material we're talking about. So I guess maybe the last issue that we want to make sure to spend a little bit of time circling back to is this issue of homework systems and platforms and how that relates to inclusive access. So there were a couple of people in the chat sort of asking if inclusive access includes courseware. And the answer is yes, in many cases it does. And in many cases it may include courseware when, regardless of whether it's sort of what you asked for. Like this model is in many ways sort of designed to push the market toward using more digital materials that are sort of required in order to do things like turn in homework or perform assessments, things like that. So I think that there are a few issues that arise around this. So the first is that when there is courseware, specifically homework systems tied to inclusive access, the fact that students can opt out is sort of a misnomer, because in many cases, students, even if they opt out, they still need to be able to access the homework system in order to turn in their homework. They may be able to buy it from, independently through the bookstore or from another source, but, we know of cases where they can't. So if they opt out of inclusive access and getting automatically billed, they essentially start their course at a lower grade because they're not going to have a way to turn in their homework. In fact, there was some litigation that looked at this. So the other sort of bigger issue that surrounds this is that, we were seeing in the chat many people pointing out that these homework systems are things that faculty want and in some cases need to teach their courses. And, regardless of sort of any other thoughts on that, I think it's important that higher ed, really listen to faculty on this and recognize that, if faculty are saying, I need this tool in order to do my job, we should be thinking about that differently than the way we've always thought about textbooks, which is a commodity or something that you sort of purchase at, a store on campus, or that you procure on your own through a retail model, but as essential ed tech that's required for faculty to collect homework from students and be able to assess them. And I think that difference is something that higher ed is going to need to reckon with. And it is not ethical to essentially require students to pay tuition and then pay another fee in order to turn in their homework. That's not an ethical system. Obviously not saying anything against individuals who've made that choice, because this is the system we work within. But that kind of system is not one that we should be setting up long-term as we're thinking about, what model do we want to use for course material affordability? What do we want to support? And making sure that we're really thinking about what steps can we take now to plan ahead for a world where most faculty feel that they need a homework system in order to assess students, and making sure that we're, sort of, rather than using this piecemeal model where, we're telling students they can opt out, but if they opt out, they can't turn in their homework or they get a lower grade. we're actually sitting down and thinking about, like, how do we negotiate contracts that ensure that we're getting the best possible deal for our students? How do we look at alternatives? You know, there've been a number of people who mention supplemental materials that can work with OER, so you can sort of avoid paying a lot of money for the textbook portion of the material, and have a lower cost for the courseware model. And then also thinking longer term about what kind of investments can we be making as an academic community and building the kind of technology that we need for the future. And you know, there's been federal investment in open educational resources, adaptive learning, technology, and you know, how do we think about making those investments in a way that's sustainable and allows institutions to keep prices low longer term, and address some of these, you know, challenges that we are going to need to confront as higher ed becomes more and more digital, and you know, more evidence builds about the benefit of using these types of digital materials. So I know that we're coming up on time. Trudy, would you like to close us out?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I actually just want to kind of go back to something you said, Nicole, earlier about, like, you know, it behooves us to think intentionally about the solutions we're looking to and investing in to fill these gaps. And I guess the final thing I would say is there are, I think, really a lot of administrators, a lot of faculty, a lot of campus personnel in good faith are trying to have solutions to problems that really do exist. You know, we're in this digital environment now. COVID has really changed the education landscape. There are gaps. And I would just, I guess, encourage us, as Nicole was saying, to think about a stopgap versus a solution, because there is a difference. There's a difference between a stopgap and a solution. And I think a lot of times private corporations come in with stopgaps to try to fill holes that they recognize in the market. And while those holes exist, it behooves us to come up with solutions instead of temporary fixes or fixes that might seem a little bit easier in the moment, to consider, you know, what are the long-term equity implications? I think that's what it comes down to. What are the long-term equity and success implications for our students? And on that note, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to be respectful of your guys' time. And yeah, I'm just so grateful you joined us, so grateful that you gave us this platform and the opportunity to speak with you all today. So yeah, on behalf of myself and Spark, thanks for showing up. And if you have questions, please visit inclusiveaccess.org. You can also get involved there. We have a form you guys can fill out to subscribe to our listserv that we're in the process of generating, and you can stay involved with what we're doing here. So thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Happy Open Education Week.
Happy Open Ed, guys. Bye.
Yeah.